Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. The White House remains, quote, frustrated at Israel's refusal to share its plans to retaliate against Iran for its ballistic missile attack last week, according to the Wall Street Journal. This follows Israel's strike against Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah last month, which it conducted without informing the U.S. ahead of time. That bombing, which took place as Washington was reportedly hoping to finalize a ceasefire plan between Israel and Lebanon, surprised and angered senior administration officials. Israeli strikes on Iran could have repercussions in Washington as the presidential election approaches and the economy is a top campaign issue. Oil prices rose last week after President Biden suggested that U.S. officials were considering whether to support an Israeli strike on Iranian oil facilities. A day later, the president appeared at a White House press briefing to say Israel should refrain from attacking them. Walter, news or faux news?
With these kinds of stories, you just never really know what's going on. This is just, he said, she said. It's various reporters getting tips from various sources, and everybody the fog of war is thick. What seems to be, to the extent there's any real news, it's what we already knew, which is that Israel wants a more aggressive attack on Iran than the administration would prefer, and that intense discussions are taking place. You call that news? I don't really call that news.
There's a lot of people who seem to think that the Israelis are withholding these plans from the U.S. in part because they're worried about leaks. Do you think that's a real going concern, or is this administration no more leaky than any other?
Well, what was it Mark Twain used to say, that two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead? And, so leaks are always an issue. And, even in Jerusalem, leaks have been known to occur. And when you're talking about very, very sensitive war plans, naturally the pressure is there. But again, it's in Bibi's political interest in Israel to look as if he is fighting off American pressure and nothing is going to deter him from doing everything that it takes for Israel to succeed. And Biden, there's a big political upside. He is doing everything he can to bring peace to the Middle East and calm the Israelis while respecting their genuine concerns. So this narrative actually helps both Biden and Bibi. So I don't see huge efforts by either side to extinguish it. And so the leakers are being strategic. Leaks are usually more credible when it's a leak of something principals really wouldn't want revealed. This is perfectly normal.
All right, our second story. Beneath the headline results in many polls, something unusual has turned up with big implications for politics. More voters are calling themselves Republicans than Democrats, according to the Wall Street Journal, suggesting that the GOP has its first durable lead in party identification in more than 3 decades. The development gives former President Donald Trump an important structural advantage in the November election. Other factors could prove more important to the outcome, and Vice President Kamala Harris still leads narrowly in many polls, in some cases because she does well with independent voters. But a pollster who works on NBC News surveys commented that, quote, the biggest deal in polling is when lines cross, and for the first time in decades, Republicans now have the national edge on party ID. He called the development, quote, the under-recognized game changer for 2024. Walter, is this news or faux news?
There is a piece of news there that higher percentage of voters are identifying as Republican. That's actually interesting news. But almost all of the analysis that we're getting is fluff. I mean, important structural advantage for Trump, and yet the polls don't show it. I mean, what is, this is just, yeah, election is coming. It's a little bit like we had massive Hurricane Milton will destroy Florida. The media like drama. And particularly in an election like this that looks close and everybody is, it feels very intensely about, looking for any tiny little bump to the narrative. But, the fact that the Republican Party is attracting more supporters doesn't necessarily translate into more votes for Trump. So the attempt to kind of link that poll to the thing everybody is interested in is disingenuous, but maybe it's just journalism as usual. Possibly if it was going to have any implication, I would say it would be more in House races, where I think a lot of what I've seen has suggested the Republicans may well lose control of the House in the election, no matter what happens at the top. If to the extent this is real, that could be a favorable wind. But again, let's not forget that independents are a very large share of the vote. And if independents are trending away from the Republicans in a specific race or generally, this voter ID thing isn't going to affect it. I suppose the one thing that you do see that lends just a little bit of support would be that the Senate races seem to have kind of a number of Senate races seem the Republicans seem to be doing a bit better than we saw a couple of weeks ago. Again, that's not going to have to do with this big voter ID thing. But to the extent that I can see any trends out there, that the two are that Harris has stopped gaining on Trump, but seems to be a little bit ahead of Trump, but less in the battleground states. Doesn't tell you really anything about what's happening, but that does seem to be the poll. And that, again, in Montana, and the Republican candidate seems to have a significant lead, and there's some other places where Republican Senate candidates are doing better than people thought they would do.
All right, final story of the week. The escalating violence in the Middle East is threatening the Democratic coalition in the United States, according to the New York Times. Arab American voters show signs of abandoning the Democratic ticket, while some American Jews worry about their future in a party their families embrace for generations. Nowhere are those tensions more politically important than in Michigan, a crucial battleground state with a significant population of Arab American and Muslim voters. 4 years ago, President Biden won Michigan with strong backing from many of those Americans. But interviews this weekend with voters, activists, and community leaders, in addition to polling in the Detroit area, suggested that support for the Democratic ticket has not merely eroded among Arab Americans and Muslims. In some key areas, it has all but vanished. Walter, news or faux news?
I think faux news. I don't think that the Arab American swing vote population in Michigan is the key to Harris carrying Michigan. And that in general, what you have is, what you'd see in the polling generally is that more people in Michigan would be happy with a more supportive policy on Israel than would be happy with a less supportive policy on Israel. But that would obviously work out differently in different groups. There are an awful lot of pretty conservative Christians in Michigan, for example. So, what we can say is that the fact that the world is burning down and that the Biden administration doesn't appear to be very effective in tamping down flames or solving problems, that's generically not good for the administration. And the fact that it has been unable to bring some kind of solution, peace, and almost a year, well, now more than a year after the October 7 attacks. Yes, that I think is a factor in some of the problems the administration may be having, and this is a subset of that. But again, I think we're just going into media hype to say endangers the Democratic coalition. Oh my goodness, the sky is falling. In some of this reporting too, and you'll get it in pro-Zionist, pro-Israel circles as well as anti, there's a lot of deliberate disinformation by reporters that are trying to push a certain public narrative. So you will see among people who themselves would like to see the U.S. distance itself more from Israel, they will go on and on about, oh, that vital Arab vote, and you're going to lose the vital Arab vote unless you listen to me. It's going to be a disaster. Oh my gosh, what you're doing is the worst thing in the world. You get a lot of that. And then you also will get the critical Jewish vote or evangelical vote over here. It's going to go completely against you. That, this goes back as long as there has been a state of Israel. So I am not overly impressed by this kind of journalism.
Just one final question on that. Do you think the candidates are kind of making the same mistake in Pennsylvania, where apparently they're, trying to court the Jewish vote in Philadelphia? Both parties, both candidates, are they kind of blowing the salience or centrality of the, Israeli-Palestinian conflict to American national presidential politics? Are they focusing too much on it?
I think I think both sides have looked at the Fetterman polling, which I think we've talked about this before, Jeremy, but Fetterman's polling, his numbers shot through the roof when he began to sort of be such a leader on a pro-Israel side. And that has to scratch your heads. But you'll notice that the New York Times runs many fewer stories about how lack of enthusiastic support for Israel is that going to cause Harris to lose the vital swing state of Pennsylvania? Somehow that just doesn't seem to make it past the news filter. Again, I would not say somebody is deliberately trying to create a false narrative here, but they're just, when we have certain biases, there's some things we see more easily and more clearly than others.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. Earlier this week, of course, marked 1 year since the attacks of October 7th, Walter, which changed certainly Israel and the Middle East, but also America and the world in many ways. You wrote this week about how one of the things October 7th did was awaken an entire generation to the realization that, quote, their elders fundamentally misjudged the nature of the times we live in, and that young people in America and elsewhere are going to have to make their own way through a world for which they have been neither intellectually nor emotionally prepared. Tell us a bit more about what you meant by that and why October 7th, of all the tragedies and calamities in the world, was the catalyst for it.
Well, I just think that the imagery of October 7th, where you have a music festival of young people, all ready to be blissed out on their favorite music and perhaps their favorite substances, and life is completely carefree, and we're just all high on life and being young and being happy. And then all of a sudden, these paragliders come in and they rape, pillage, and murder their way across the rock festival and drag some of those kids off into the most hideous captivity where they still are today. That is a little bit too much like what's going on in the world as a whole. That since 1990, it's been the global rave. History is over, party time. History, national security policy is no longer about trying to protect us from enemies that would destroy us out there and having really effective military forces. It's about, climate change is a national security issue. So let's make sure we have greener fuel choices for our destroyers or whatever it may be, or that, the issues set that we need to work on, let's see, agricultural improvements, gender equality in Burkina Faso, there's just a long list of really important things. And, eradicating guinea worm, which, by the way, is a wonderful thing. And congratulations to former President Jimmy Carter on decades of really great work. This is all good stuff in its way, but it is not now, never has been, and I fear never will be the core of national security policy and strategy, which is to prevent devastating war by combining the military strength and the diplomatic sensibility and judgment in order to minimize the irreducible risk. You can't reduce it to zero. You Can't eradicate it, but you can reduce and minimize the risk. And if, God forbid, it comes, you're ready. I remember seeing, in a lot of college campuses when Trump was elected in 2016, there were all of these incredibly distraught kids who thought the world was ending. I mean, it's normal when you're 17, 18 years old to think that this election is the most important election in the history of the universe, and you don't even know what it's like to have your candidate lose. So there's a bit of inexperience in it, but there's also here for this is a generation that's been told we're going to have safe spaces. Some people are really disturbed by the sound of hand clapping, so we're going to do jazz hands applause. We're just going to absolutely cover like all surfaces in, hypoallergenic bruise protection. There are going to be no sharp edges anywhere. And we're going to, every child is going to thrive in the system, and you will never hear a disturbing ethnic or personal reference. And if you do, the appropriate response is to have an emotional meltdown and bring in the power, all the powers of the institution, because we are going to keep life free of annoyances, distractions, and all bad things. And that is that's what we've been telling kids that we are doing for them and the place where they're going to be. But in a world where Donald Trump can get elected president, there is no space that a kid at a liberal Northeastern private college is going to recognize as safe. In fact, there are no safe spaces anywhere. There are these things called nuclear weapons. Some of them are actually controlled by people who hate you and would like to see you dead. This is a fact of life. And, as we so sort of shifted our strategic thing and so on, we got into what I think of as an almost psychotic state of denial. And I think denial is part of what it is. The reality is in some ways so terrifying. There's climate change is real, and you know what? Human society and human diplomats are terrible at making the kinds of changes that might be required to control the temperature of the world, if that's even doable. And we're gonna have to live with it and deal with it and adapt to it. There are the methods of weapons of mass destruction are proliferating. President Obama destroyed forever the thin fading hopes that there would be any kind of real non-proliferation. And we are more likely to see a cascade of nuclear proliferation in the next few years than we have since the bomb was first invented. The arms race in cyber and biological war is out of control and does not seem to be subject to any of the traditional methods of arms limitation. Democracy is in retreat globally, and authoritarian states are gaining more power and are using it more effectively. All of these things are happening. They are not illusions. And yet, again, we have tried for 30 years, interrupted briefly by the trauma of 9/11. We have tried to live as if all history was over. And not in some grand, by the way, Hegelian, Fukuyaman sense, but history in the sense of bad, scary things happening to us was over. It's not over. You could almost say that what we've seen since 1990, we've been living through the eye of a hurricane, and that all the ferocious storms that caused World War I, World War II, the Cold War, those kinds of historical convulsions, the forces that led to those are very much with us. In some ways, they are more powerful than ever. The weapons that humanity has are more terrible than ever, more capable of causing more destruction. And I'm afraid that's just what it is. Those paragliders coming, coming down into our music festival are real. So we need to think much harder about how we educate our kids, and for that matter, how do we shape our own views of the world, Jeremy? I know you've got some young kids and maybe another on the way, and you're not going to be able to raise those kids. Obviously, when they're very little, they need to have that feeling that mom and dad can stop the bad things from happening. But part of what your duty as a parent is going to be to help them learn to live and thrive and flourish in a world where terrible things happen. This may seem to people who grew up in the flower age seem impossible. I mean, a tiny little ethnic slur, and I'm completely, my life is devastated for weeks. Somebody uses the wrong pronoun at me, and I suffer irrecoverable damage, or someone says something mean about a presidential candidate that I like, and I can't take it. Well, we're going to all have to learn how to take a lot. I remember hearing from a friend once that what a lot of people need is some insensitivity training. I wouldn't go that far. I think, I don't try to offend people or use ugly ethnic references. I think it's bad. I think it's wrong. But on the other hand, when somebody does something or says something that I don't like, I need to suck it up and keep going and not let these irritations and bad things interfere with my ability to make the contribution that I can make and to live the life I'm meant to live. And, the microaggressions and so on. I mean, obviously that is very small stuff, but we've got to continue living creatively, intelligently, prudently, and effectively in the shadow of unimaginable catastrophe. And our failure to do that makes catastrophe more likely, not less. We all have a lot of work to do. And that is really my sort of fundamental sense of what what is something useful that we can bring out of the horror that was launched on October 7.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this time from Alex in Oakland, who wants to know, quote, what is the most underrated U.S. state?
Well, I do think of, I'm from, I was born in South Carolina, but spent a lot of my formative years in what some in my family consider the much more sophisticated and worldly state of North Carolina. But in the seventh grade, I had to take a class in North Carolina history, which is a subject perhaps not all of my listeners are familiar with, is in a better world they would be. Among the things we had to learn were what were the four capital crimes in North Carolina. At the time, those were murder, arson, rape, and treason against the state of North Carolina. And I was, I could, murder, rape, arson. Okay, I know what those are, and hopefully I'm not going to be committing any of those. But what exactly is treason against the state of North Carolina? That was a bit of a puzzle. Is it like rooting for Clemson at a football game? Is it saying that Andrew Jackson was born in South Carolina? What exactly do you have to do to fall on the wrong side of that one? But I do remember that we also had to learn the North Carolina state anthem, which includes the unforgettable lyrics, to me unforgettable, because I clearly haven't forgotten them after 60 years. Carolina, Carolina, heaven's blessings attend thee while I live. I will, whatever, forgetting some of them. But here it goes. Though scorners may sneer at and witlings defame her, still our hearts swell with gladness whenever we name. It's the most defensive lyric I can think of. It's like, really, what happened to you? Did somebody drop a house on your sister this morning? What is going on? It's a very defensive, prickly thing. So I think on that basis, I'd be willing to say that North Carolina is pretty underestimated. I'd also say poor New Jersey gets a rough deal. Everybody likes to say something mean about New Jersey and nasty about New Jersey. And it is true that not every mile of the New Jersey Turnpike is a delight to the soul, refreshes the spirit. I'm not sure either that the best way to commemorate American poets is to name public bath rest stops after them. The Walt Whitman rest stop is a sort of interesting concept there. But still, New Jersey actually, there's some very nice towns in New Jersey, nice schools in New Jersey. There's even a very lovely college in New Jersey by the name of Princeton. And you can go out to Princeton, you think there's really not a lot wrong with the world. This is very pretty and feels great. There were some great Revolutionary War battles in New Jersey, great heroism there. And yet we just consider it the most worthless of all states. So maybe New Jersey needs to rewrite its state anthem and come up with some more affirmational lyrics in there or something.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.